Okay, so in this lecture, we are going to talk about what the consequences of World War II were for the United States. So in this block, we've been talking about the causes of war, generally, not just World War II, the causes of all wars. And what we've identified is that wars stem from problems of misrepresentation in an anarchic environment that's uncertain, right? So there are incentives to misrepresent. There's incentives to mask or misrepresent your power and your resolve in order to improve your bargaining position. And we talked about why. But sometimes that leads to bargaining failure, which is uh, an inefficient outcome that is consistent with the idea of war, where its resources are destroyed that otherwise would have been saved. The other aspect of that we talked about was the dynamic commitment problem, which can occur even if there is complete information theoretically, which is that a deal that is struck between one or two parties today may not be honored in the future because of shifts in conditions, shifts in power, shifts in the value of the good, etc. Right? So there are those two distinct causes of war. One was the uncertainty coupled with incomplete information and incentives to misrepresent and the first strike advantage, and the other was the dynamic commitment problems. I think you could make the case that both of those conditions were present at the onset of World War II. What you can say, though, is that unlike most wars, World War II and its predecessor, World War I, were fundamentally system transforming, right? So the entire shape of the international system changed as a result of World War II, particularly the place of the United States. It's often said, and I think probably many of you, if you've taken history in high school, that after World War II, the United States became the world's superpower, one of the world's superpowers, and it has remained in that position since that point. I think it's probably, if we think about what that means, I think a better way to characterize the US position, and I think most studies of international political economy would characterize the United States this way. At that point, the United States became what was known as a hegemon, which is a state that was head and shoulders above everyone else in terms of its political influence, its military influence, its economic influence, and its cultural influence. And again, I think it's fair to say that the US is still in that position. It's interesting because if you were to talk to security experts, they would make the case, I think, that the US is in decline. And if you were to talk to scholars of international political economy, they would actually say the opposite, right? Particularly even after COVID, that the US is still in a position of preeminence. So I want to talk to you about how to combine those two ideas of IP with security and how they fit together, and talk to you about how this led to a situation where after the war, after World War II, the US created the modern rules of the international state system, and created norms that most of us just take for granted today, but we want to think about them. And then because we're interested in understanding theories across time and space, we also understand what might contribute to that, to those changes, right? What might contribute to the United States changing its position. Now, we'd like to think, or I think many of you would like to think, that the United States might stay around in this position forever, right? And again, that's not just me, that's probably several American allies, et cetera, right? But I want you to bear in mind that no country has ever stayed in that position forever. Everything changes, right? The system is dynamic. So even though a country may be powerful today, there is a significant chance that in the future its place might change, right? There was a famous phrase by Winston Churchill that the sun would never set on the British Empire, but it did, right? So we want to talk about what contributes to a country rising to that position and what contributed to the US rise to that position, and think about what might contribute to that changing. So to get to that discussion, let me pull up the lecture slides. And again, let's start with this idea that I think most of us come into this class thinking that the United States is powerful and can be characterized as the most powerful country on earth today. I don't think many people would dispute that. I think people would dispute how powerful the US is relative to other rivals, perhaps China, Russia, et cetera. But I think most scholars of international politics and most policymakers and most politicians would conclude that the United States is indeed the most powerful country on earth. But stop and think about why. Again, the United States represents, in terms of population, only 5% of the world's population, and yet it has influence over 95% of the world's population. So why is that? Well, let's think about why that is. Well, so what we're going to focus on is challenges to the structures that the US created, The US created system has included a set of international institutions that we think of as forming the global order that has survived for 70 years. Interestingly, they've also led to a period of substantial economic growth, particularly from 1980 on, and falling poverty in the world. You might not think that, right? It's often easy not to think that poverty is falling in the world or that life expectancy is increasing in the world. But I can tell you, based on the data, that is absolutely true, right? That in a sense, the world seems to be getting better, or at least it did until recently, until COVID, and I think until the last maybe 5 years. So if that's the case, that suggests, at least in terms of correlation, that US hegemony may not have been something that was zero sum and just benefited the United States. It might have been something that was positive sum and benefited many other individuals throughout the world, particularly if we focus on individuals versus states. So if that's true, how long can these things sustain, especially given some of the security challenges that are out there that we're going to talk about in the third block, like terrorism and civil wars and financial crises and the rise of populism, et cetera. So let's first think about this idea of hegemony. Right. Now, if we go back to the discussion of realism, which was an assumption that the system is anarchic, that states are unitary, that states are essentially the same, and the only thing that differentiates them is their power, and they're competing for power. That assumes that the international system is in anarchy. My first instructor of international relations was an individual named Ken Organski. He was at the University of Michigan. I took his class a very long time ago. And he wrote a very famous book in the late 1950s called The War Ledger. And what he argued in that book was that characterizing the international system as realist and completely anarchic wasn't quite right. If it was true that relations were governed by power, but power was unequally distributed, that doesn't mean that the system is anarchic. It means the system is hierarchical. Countries that had more power were going to be in a better position to dictate events or dictate outcomes and dictate processes to countries that had less power. So it's not purely anarchic, it's hierarchic. And what he argued was that the most powerful states in the international system would set the rules for how states govern themselves. What Organski was particularly interested in were situations when one state dominated all others. That was a situation called hegemony, where one state was all powerful, dominating the other states, was far ahead of the other states in terms of its economic power, in terms of its political influence, and in terms of its military power. That would give that one state the ability to dictate the rules of the international system to the others. Now, one might argue that that's not a fair situation where one state is that powerful. Well, according to Organski, what this actually did was provided a benefit. A hegemon provided stability, right? If the hegemon was head and shoulders above everyone else, and the hegemon set the rules, everyone would have to follow them. And sure, that might create a situation where some states were unhappy with the rules, but at least the rules were consistent, at least they could be followed, and in a sense that produced some stability in the world and some stability of expectations. Think about it in terms of the bargaining model. There would be no dispute as to which countries are more powerful. The hegemon is powerful, so if the hegemon says behave in a certain way, in a sense it doesn't make sense to try to oppose them. In terms of commitment problems, if the hegemon remains in that position of power and there are no power shifts, that doesn't create war either, right? So in a sense, what Organski was arguing, even though those bargaining theories came later, was that if you had one state that was that powerful, that would dominate all other ones in terms of military, economic, and cultural capital, that hegemon could create a period of peace and would preside over a period of peace that would reflect its view of the world. And for the hegemon to sustain its rule, what it would have to do is to start to provide global public goods in terms of stability so people would buy into the system and not start to change it. So what he would argue is that the hegemon could be something that was benevolent, that would actually give to the world, that would benefit the world. And what his argument was is that so long as the international system was unbalanced and one state was far more powerful than the other one, the hegemon would continue to dominate and the hegemon's rules would continue to stay in place. Now, one of the really interesting things about Organski's work is that it talked about change, in particular in the 1950s. And I should emphasize at this point, China had gone through something, or was going through something called the Great Leap Forward. So it was terribly, since it was had a high degree of poverty. It had gone through a famine. It looked like it was nowhere in a position to actually become a world power. Ken Organsky looked at China and said, that will be the power that will challenge the United States. And he went back to an old quote by Napoleon, which was, when China wakes up, the world will tremble. His argument was that because China had such a large population, when Chinese individuals, laborers, became as productive as Americans, given the technology, right, they would eventually be in a position to produce more goods and services than the United States just by sheer volume of their population. And so the economy of China would become much larger than that of the United States. And when the economy of China became larger than that of the United States, it would be able to field a bigger military, and it would field more and would gain more political capital, and it would gain more economic influence than the United States. And then it would eventually transition to a world where China would become the hegemon. Theoretically, this is how it works, right? This plot kind of captures it. Over time, challengers may grow at a faster rate than the hegemon. The hegemon may be in a position that dominates the others, but you may see at some point in time one power start to grow at a faster rate. And at that moment, this model forecast in 2015, though that doesn't seem to be right. A challenger may surpass the dominant power in terms of its economy, may surpass the hegemon in terms of its economic power. And his argument was, at that particular moment, when you see one power surpass the other one, that is going to be your moment where you may see conflict. Now, put that in the framework of the dynamic commitment problem. You have shifts in power. The dominant power may see change. The dominant power may fear in the future they're going to be less powerful than another country. So at that moment when they have this advantage, that might be a moment to actually wage war. Or at least, again, that's the argument that the commitment problem would make. Now, he would point to several examples of this. There haven't been too many of them, so we don't have a large and statistical test, but he would point to several examples of this. In the pre-state system, what he argued was that the decline of both Greece and Rome was consistent with a large amount of violence. He also characterized the Napoleonic Wars by violence, which was a power transition, and similarly, the transition from Spanish dominance to British dominance over the seas, that was a violent procedure. Right, and he also argued that the move from World War I to World War II were also examples of moving from British hegemony from British hegemony to American hegemony. Right, the challenge came from Germany in those instances. Germany was willing to challenge British hegemony in World War I and again in World War II, but after that, we saw a movement to American hegemony. Now, a question could be, why wasn't there a war between the United States and Britain if we saw this transition? What Organsky argued was that this wasn't the case because both the United States and Britain shared the same preferences, right? So there's two factors going into this. One is, do we see a transition? The second is, what are the preferences of the rising power and the dominant power? So according to Ken Organsky's work, because Britain and the United States basically had similar preferences and similar views of the world, neither power had incentives to challenge each other. In particular, when Britain realized it was declining, it had incentives to work with the United States to try to maintain influence over the international system, which it continued to do. So let's think about how this transition took place, and let's think about why Britain was in this position of hegemony. Right, so at the start of the 20th century, Britain, if you recall prior to this, Britain had pioneered the Industrial Revolution. Britain doesn't have a lot of people, right, but what it did have was productivity because of the Industrial Revolution, and what it did have were advantages in military technology and naval technology. All of those had enabled the British to establish a global empire, right, that extended from the British Isles to the coasts of the African continent, to the area around the Suez Canal, into Asia with India, which was what they called the jewel in the crown. In that period, the British had acquired nearly all of the world's gold reserves. At this moment in time, and still today, gold is looked at as a valuable commodity. I've always been skeptical of why, but if we look historically as to why, there's a couple of different factors that make gold valuable. One is that it lasts a long time. It's malleable. It can be turned into a whole bunch of different things. It looks nice. It's aesthetically pleasing. But most importantly, it has all these good properties, but it's also rare, right? In order for anything to be worth something, it has to be rare, right? So what the British did was they linked their currency, British pounds, to gold. What they basically said is, if they created these pieces of paper they call pounds, which are worthless by themselves, they guaranteed that those pounds could be converted into gold. And you knew that was true because the British controlled the entire world's gold supply. So what does that do? Well, If Britain creates a piece of paper and says that that's valuable, that doesn't necessarily have a lot of value, but because you knew that it could be converted into gold, suddenly those pieces of papers were indeed worth something. And as a result of that, most other countries in the world pegged their currencies to the pound, which meant that their pieces of paper became valuable. The francs, the Deutschmarks, et cetera, became valuable because you can convert those into pounds, which could then be converted into gold, right? That was how the system worked. And it worked, again, because gold was rare. If the British pegged their pounds to grass, everybody's got a lot of grass, so that would inflate the entire system. It was gold that was critical here to make this work. So since we created a system where the British, in their hegemony, became the center of the financial universe with the pound, and all of their currencies pegged themselves to the pound, this created a system of stable exchange rates and a system where exchanges could take place. Now, this would be disrupted by the onset of World War I. Right, when World War I starts, not all the countries that enter the war don't think it's going to go on for very long. Right, there's a famous story that everybody thought that they were going to enter World War I and win, but that can't all be true. Everybody can't win. And pretty soon the countries got bogged down into trench warfare, got bogged down into these very difficult conflicts, and the front line really wasn't moving anywhere, right? It was throwing resources after more resources after more resources. So happily for the British, they could just keep creating pounds because everybody wanted those pounds, and then they could buy more military supplies and more military supplies. But at some point, they were creating so many pounds, the question got raised, how much gold did the British actually have? The British answer is, sure, we got enough, we're fine, right? But at some point, that wasn't sufficient, right? So at that point, the British broke away from the gold standard and basically said they were going to allow their currency to float. Now, stop and think about this. British paper, British pounds are worth something because they convert into gold. All other currencies are worth something because they convert into pounds, which converts into gold. If British pounds don't convert into gold, everybody's currency is going to be worth nothing. Everybody's currency is going to inflate, which is why you saw a really difficult depression sweep over Europe after World War I. Their soldiers were dead. They lost millions of people. Farmland had been destroyed. And on top of that, their currencies were becoming worthless because there wasn't anything to redeem it to, and it wasn't converting into gold anymore. So what these countries did was they tried to jumpstart their economies by adopting protectionism, much like you see today, right? There's an effort to try to discriminate against foreign products, to try to raise tariffs against foreign products with an effort to try to jumpstart domestic demand. The problem with this, the critical problem with this is twofold. One, if you discriminate, so will other countries. The other problem is that at some point your market will become saturated. So suppose I build refrigerators and I discriminate against all foreign competition. You'll buy one refrigerator from me. You may buy two. Are you going to buy three? Are you going to buy four? And at some point you'll stop buying refrigerators. And at that point, what am I going to do with my labor? What am I going to do with my factory? I'm going to have to start laying people off. And when they get laid off, they stop going out to eat, they stop going to restaurants, and eventually demand will start to fall for them. The way I could normally deal with this is I could start exporting refrigerators and find foreign markets where people actually want these things. But because all countries, go to this point right here, adopted protectionist stances, nobody can export their surplus production, factories start to close, and the United States also falls into the Great Depression. Now, the way this was attempted to be solved, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan came up with a solution. The way they could solve this collapse in demand was to start wars, right? By starting wars, there would be demand for bullets, there would be demand for soldiers, there'd be demand for tanks, etc., right? And so that would create jobs, right? And supporting those soldiers would also create jobs. The problem with that is that if you build your economy based on fighting wars, what happens when wars stop? Your economy will crash. This created an insatiable need for these countries to continue fighting wars. There's a reason why Hitler wouldn't stop expanding, is because if he ever did, his whole economy would crash into pieces. So he has to always find that next enemy to fight, right? So as a result of that, what you see is that these command economies that are based on war eventually, since this pulled the entire world into World War II, and that discredits this idea of using war to try to rebuild economies. Okay, so after World War II emerges, right, the world is devastated. The Soviet Union alone lost 20 million people, 20 million people, right? So that was just an enormous loss. Germany lost millions of people. The Japanese lost untold millions of people, and the Chinese lost absolutely untold numbers of people. So the world was completely devastated. except for one place. And that one place was the United States. The United States had been spared from war. The United States was essentially fine, right? The United States had suffered only a few conflicts on its territory, Pearl Harbor and one other one, but basically US territory was intact. So the US had become the preeminent military and economic power in the world after 1945. Its infrastructure was intact. Its manufacturing capacity was intact. It controlled nearly all of the world's ships. It was the only country with the atomic bomb, and it had suffered relatively little compared to all the other countries. It certainly suffered in terms of casualties, but nothing compared to the others. What that meant is that the US was the only country with capital. The US was the only country with factories that could produce things, with land that was worth something, with farmland, et cetera, to restart the world's economic growth. So put yourself in the position of those in the Roosevelt administration and the Truman administration at the end of World War II. The world is your oyster, so to speak, right? The world requires your capital to get started. The world is going to need you, right, to try to rebuild itself. If you're in that position, no one can credibly commit to a world that does not reflect your preferences, right? If you were in that position, you would not just hand your capital out for free. You would want that capital to start reflecting your views of the world. So the United States did things like promote democracy. The United States did things like promote the end of empires. The United States tried to create a system that would reflect its own political preferences. Right. So if we think about some examples of this, right, the United States created the United Nations to be the thing that would stabilize global conflict. Right now, who are the 5 members of the UN Permanent Security Council? They're the 5 Allied victories of World War II. What the United Nations codified was that territorial aggression was unlawful. Right. But because of the veto system, any one of those 5 powers could engage in aggression if they wanted to, because they could always veto condemnation. Additionally, the UN outlawed territorial aggression, but said nothing about previous aggression, like United States aggression against Spain to conquer Florida, like United States aggression against Native American tribes, et cetera, right? So that was fine, right? But any future aggression that would change the status quo, that would be not allowed, right? So if we really look at some of the norms that you think about, why democracy is something that's valuable, why even North Korea says it's democratic, right? Why we look at things like free trade and capitalism as being good things, all of those reflect the US position of power after 1945, right? That's why we've adopted many of these things as just norms, and we don't even think about them anymore. One of the other areas that was critical was the adoption of the American dollar at the center of world finance. So the British pound came before. It was then supplanted by the American dollar as the center of global finance. So the United States was going to take this privilege from the British. Now, what this did, like the British system before, was that it stabilized global interest rates by pegging all currencies to the dollar. And the dollar was going to be pegged to gold like the British pound before. As a result of the wars, the United States had acquired most of the world's gold reserves, and it pegged its dollars to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce, right? So as long as you had dollars, you could convert those dollars into gold. And if your currency was tied to the US dollar, you could use those currencies, convert them into dollars, and then convert that into gold. Right. So what this did was it created a system where